Alright guys, for this video real quick, I'm going to show you how to put together gluten-free hamburger buns. That's what I'm going to attempt to do. I haven't had a whole lot of success with these, but I'm hoping today with these two different recipes we'll get some similar success going on here. Usually the last time we did the gluten-free hamburger buns, we saw kind of two different techniques coming together. Some techniques coming from the yeast raised doughs that we're used to working with, and some things that are more similar to maybe a biscuit, breaking up cold butter into dry ingredients, working with very tacky doughs. So you're kind of seeing two different worlds coming together here. Very, very interesting. Now here today I have a Pillsbury gluten-free all-purpose flour blend. I've tried a few different ones. I've never tried this one. I'm going to try it today. I do suggest if you're doing gluten-free products, you go out, you find a brand that you like to use. They all have different ratios, they have different flavors, they have different consistencies. So experience is really the best thing that you can do. Start working with some of these different products. If you look in the gluten-free bread or any of the gluten-free recipes in chapter 26 in your book, the chapter for special baking, baking for special diets, you are going to see a breakdown of a lot of different dry ingredients. For example, the gluten-free yeast bread, you're seeing rice flour, potato starch, tapioca flour, cornstarch. A lot of different dry ingredients that are trying to simulate the consistency of normal flour without all that gluten, the gluten proteins, right? So this essentially is that. It's already mixed together into a nice ratio concoction that is supposed to be able to use a perfect substitute for all-purpose flour if you were trying to modify your own. I do suggest, in my experience, I haven't had a whole lot of success with modifying regular yeast dough recipes with this. I suggest using a gluten-free bread recipe because there's some different ingredients and different processes that are involved, okay? So it's a little bit more tricky to substitute bread specifically, right? Remember that. The products that we want gluten out of, those are the tricky ones to use a gluten-free all-purpose flour substitute. Chocolate chip cookies, cakes, things that are already tender, muffins, quick breads that we don't want gluten, essentially you can just substitute those same old recipes. You just use the gluten-free flour into those and you really do get a pretty decent product, okay? But for these yeast breads, we're trying to simulate that gluten, okay? So not only do we have the drier ingredients in the cornstarch to absorb the moisture, but we have something in here called xanthan gum. Now this is a gum derived from natural products and plants. It is meant to add a bindingness to the dough, a stickiness, something to hold the dough, dry ingredients together, provide it structure, trap in moisture, okay? Because that's really what we have issues with when we're doing gluten-free bread with yeast. Yeast is the leavening agent, right? It causes it to rise. Well, there's no gluten structures, no gluten proteins to hold the gases in. The gases just escape and your bread doesn't rise normally. So we have to simulate essentially the gluten structures, and that's what the xanthan gum is essentially doing, okay? So the first question for the assignment is, why do we use xanthan gum in gluten-free recipes, okay? And we're gonna go ahead and get started. So right here, I have, you can kind of see it, I think, you're seeing more of me right now. I have one recipe, the gluten-free yeast recipe, gluten-free yeast bread recipe in your book, okay? Instead, I did use active yeast instead of the instant. I woke it up in some warm water with sugar. It is ready to go, light and frothy, you can see there. So we're gonna go ahead and start getting all these ingredients into the bowl. Because we're using a big concoction of different dry ingredients, we wanna make sure that we have a really good uniform mixture of our dry ingredients. So we just give those a quick stir. In your recipe, you see it says instant yeast is supposed to go in with the dry ingredients, but because it's active and I wanted to make it go a little bit quicker, I woke it up in the water first, okay? We do have a couple weird ingredients though that you're gonna start to see. For example, this recipe, we have vinegar. Egg whites is not too uncommon, but the other recipe I'm gonna be using has baking soda and vinegar, okay? So you're starting to see some chemical leaveners. Why do we see those? We see those because, like I said, there's not enough gluten proteins. There's no gluten proteins, right? There is not the same structure as gluten bread to hold in the carbon dioxide that the yeast is creating, right? All those gases. So we have to use a chemical leavener to add in an extra type of leavening to cause that proper rise so that we're getting that same texture. Essentially, the yeast in a lot of these gluten-free breads has some leavening power, but the baking soda, baking powder, any of those chemical leaveners will also have a rise to it. So the yeast is, half of it's really for flavor. We want that flavor like the real yeast bread. It's not giving enough giving us as much leavening power, okay? So this is where you're gonna start to see a weird recipe with yeasts and chemical leaveners coming together specifically for gluten-free recipes, okay? It's kind of a weird concept. So for this recipe, we're gonna go ahead and essentially just get everything in the bowl, start mixing just like a normal dough, okay? So let's go ahead and mix our egg whites in there. We're gonna get our yeast, our water, we're gonna put our vinegar in there, and we're gonna start mixing. Now, I hope you can see the mixer. What attachment do we have on here? Paddle attachment, right? Very interesting. Normally we're used to using a dough hook for making bread, right? Well, there's no gluten. So a dough hook, we're not going to be needing, creating that gluten. So typically, paddles are used for gluten-free bread and shorter mixing times. There's no gluten to be developed, so shorter mixing times work just as great. We're gonna go ahead and start mixing this one together. And because there's no gluten, there's not as much structure, usually a higher water content, you're going to see something that resembles more of a batter than a dough, okay? So we're gonna get this one mixing right now, and we're gonna start my other recipe mixing over here. I hope you can see it. I'm gonna scoot this one over just a little bit. We'll let that one mix. Same thing with this recipe. Really, we're just gonna get everything combined. All the dry ingredients come together. Make sure that they're uniformly mixed. Boom. This actually has an ounce of melted butter in it, so I'm gonna add a little bit of melted butter. Should be about an ounce. Mix that up. We're gonna get all the ingredients in for this recipe. So once again, we've got vinegar, we've got egg whites, we've got our water and our yeast. We got our softened butter. Okay, and we're gonna go ahead and start doing the same thing with this. We're gonna start mixing it. Now both recipes suggest mixing these on high speeds for about 3 minutes. I'm gonna add just a little more flour to this. It's supposed to be a batter, but I want it to be a little bit more solid. Let's add a little bit more flour to that. Should be good. But this is a thinner recipe. This one is supposed to come together a little bit more. Now this one says once it does create the dough ball, we are going to increase the speed for about 3 minutes and try to turn it into more of a whipped batter looking texture, okay? This recipe here suggests a fermentation time. This recipe does not, okay? Now why do we need a fermentation time? Usually that's allowing the yeast to strengthen and grow. It's allowing the gluten strands to relax and strengthen as well. But we don't have any gluten strands here, right? So typically a gluten-free bread, do we really need to bulk ferment it? That first step, not really. This recipe suggests that we do it though, so we're gonna give it a shot. This one, we're actually gonna get right into the oven, okay? Question number 2. What are the 2 ingredients that we rarely see in recipes come together, do we see in these 2 recipes? What 2 ingredients? Hint, leavening. This one's starting to look really good. I'm gonna scrape down the bowl just to make sure everything's getting mixed correctly. Some dry ingredients on the bottom there. Gonna go just a little bit longer. one's supposed to change from a dough to more of a batter looking consistency. It's still pretty thick. I've got a little bit more water in my container here with the yeast, so we're just gonna make sure that that's all in the recipe. Notice these are not vegan products, right? We've got egg whites, we've got butter in here. So, gluten-free and vegan are very, very different, right? Adding another little pinch of water. We're not looking for gluten development, right? But we do need to still understand the steps of yeast production, right? So that's where the bread, thinking back to proper yeast dough breads, similar production. We're gonna let it rise. We need to let it rise before it bakes. So even though this recipe isn't going to be bulk fermented, it's not gonna rise all together in the first step. It is going to sit and rise in the pan before it bakes. We don't need to bulk ferment it and then shape it and then proof it again, but we do let it proof that once in the pan, and then we're gonna go right in the oven. So it's a little bit quicker. All right, I'm gonna let this one keep running, and we're gonna go ahead and pan this one up. Now, because these are such a different consistency than you're used to working with, you kind of have to use some different techniques. Like I was saying, for the biscuits, you know, if they're really, really tacky, you're gonna use a lot of flour, making sure that it doesn't stick too much. Work quickly, work cleanly. Chilling, retarding the dough, even though there's no gluten proteins, retarding and chilling the dough can still allow the dough to retract back in on itself and make it a little bit easier to work with, okay? So this recipe here, this one will probably chill it a little bit. This one we're going to go ahead and get into the pan. Now this says it's supposed to be a white loaf pan bread. It's such a wet batter. You can see it there. So in a pan, right, it's going to hold its shape pretty well. No big deal. But if I want to do hamburger buns, it's not going to hold its shape pretty well on the tray, right? So I'm actually going to use these rings, metal rings. I sprayed them, put them on parchment paper, and I'm going to put some batter in there and see if that doesn't hold its shape well enough. You gotta leave room for them to rise, right? So I think right about there should be good. And we're gonna see how that goes. We need to let these rise, and then we're going to bake them at 400 degrees for probably a short amount of time. The recipe says 400 degrees for about 50 minutes for a whole loaf, but these are smaller. We're gonna give them probably about half that time. We do need to let them rise though. Are we going to see a full double in size like we do with our normal yeast doughs? Probably not. Like I said, there's no gluten proteins, no gluten strands in here to trap those gases. So a little bit of rise, if we see that from this, should be okay. Remember, the denser your dough is for these gluten-free products, the denser your final product is probably going to be. So seeing that this is a really wet batter gives me hope to think that this is probably a really nice, light, fluffy hamburger bun, okay? So we're going to let these rise. We're going to bake them off, and we'll come back to those. Real quick, this dough is not a bad consistency. There's dough is not a bad consistency, but it is a little dense and it's not quite doing what the recipe said it was supposed to be doing, which is supposed to change from a dough ball to more of a whipped batter. So I added a little bit of water already into there, but I don't want to change it too much. And I'm kind of curious to see how this dough comes out. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the mixer, and I'm going to allow it to go to the next step, which for this recipe, she suggested doing a bulk fermentation, allowing it to just rest and rise as if it was a normal yeast dough. So I'm going to let this rest and rise. Then I'm going to chill it, and we're going to try to shape it up and play with it. At the same time, I'm going to allow the other dough to proof, and I'm going to bake it off, and we'll come back and we'll take a peek at that. Awesome. Okay, so we're going to finish up on our gluten-free breads here that we were talking about a little bit earlier. Take a peek at how they look when they came out of the oven and talk a little bit about the consistencies, the textures, what you should be looking for as you're mixing, okay? I think you guys can see me in the video here, right? Okay, so we saw the video where I was mixing the gluten-free bread. So we understand we've got different products, so we're looking for different procedures, different makeup methods essentially, and really different consistencies and, let's say, types of dough that we're looking for, okay? So the first video, I had one recipe off to the left here. That was the gluten-free bread recipe out of the book, okay? And the other recipe is a recipe that I found offline, and that is this recipe right here. It's actually the same recipe that Lexi and I tried to make those gluten-free hamburger buns a couple months ago, and I still honestly had a similar problem that Lexi and I had earlier. So we can take a peek at those real quick. Selection of your gluten-free flours. I don't think I talked about it in this video, but I think I talked about it on one of the assignments. Selecting the proper flour, the one that you like, flavor-wise, texture-wise is important too, but keeping it fresh. Your gluten-free flour does turn rancid very quickly because it has other things in it. It's not just a wheat product. It has tapioca in it. It has corn products in it. It has rice flour products in it, right? So those things do tend to go bad quickly, and they get a rancid flavor when they turn bad, so you don't get a great flavor out of your products. That flavor does transfer over, okay? The other thing, like I was saying, the dough's consistency that you should be looking for. It's going to be different than, say, a normal dough, a yeast dough. So a normal yeast dough, let's say a hard roll, it's going to have a pretty, let's say, dense texture. It's not tacky necessarily. It's solid. Let's say like a Play-Doh consistency, right? Easy going, not too bad, but not tacky or wet, right? Whereas you saw with this recipe that I was doing, it came out like a batter, right? Well, this recipe, the one that Lexi and I did it earlier and I tried again today, when Lexi and I did it the first time, it was really, really dense. And we already know that the makeup, the components of the flour that we're using doesn't absorb water in the same way that flour does. It doesn't react the same way. It doesn't create gluten. It doesn't have the same protein. So it does stay denser. And the denser the product, the harder it is for the yeast to cause it to rise, which means the texture, the final end texture and consistency is usually going to be really dense. A good rule of thumb is if you're trying to make a really light, fluffy, gluten-free bread, your dough is going to be more of a wet batter consistency so that it's easier for it to become light and airy and fluffy. You need that to happen during the proofing to bake so that you do end up with a nice and light and fluffy product, okay? So this one, if you remember when I was talking about the recipe, it told me to whip it until the dough ball formed away from the center of the bowl and became more of a whipped consistency. I didn't really see that when we first mixed it. So I added, I think, roughly 3 to 4 more ounces of water to this and whipped it at high speed until it resembled more of a cookie dough consistency, kind of wet and tacky. And then I let it rise a little bit more, and that fixed the consistency a little bit, but I would suggest even more water in this. It's still really dense. The more dense your dough is, the more dense your final product is probably going to be, okay? Allowing it to properly rise, though, just like any bread, is very, very important. If it doesn't rise properly in the proofer, it's going to bake and probably be really dense at the same time. So here you can see it's not terribly dense. It's got an okay smell. It's kind of like bread, but it's got like an interesting after smell. It's interesting, but it's relatively dense. And look at the different crumb. It doesn't really look exactly like a normal bread. It, in my opinion, resembles more of a cake or a quick bread, even though we mix ingredients. We use yeast similar to, say, a yeast dough, right? But there's no gluten in the flour. You're not going to create gluten, so you're not going to get the same texture in the inside. You just won't. What we're trying to do is we're trying to make something that resembles bread as much as possible, that will trick this gluten-free customer so that they can enjoy a hamburger the same as any other person and not have to worry about the bun, right? They don't have to worry about the outside part of the product. They can eat it just as any other person, but they don't have to worry about hurting themselves, okay? This was the yeast bread out of the book, the gluten-free yeast bread out of the book, that really wet batter one that I poured into the rings and then baked off. After it proofed, there was no bulk fermentation. This came out really actually light and fluffy. I'm impressed. This is one of the best gluten-free breads that I've probably ever done. I did let it fully double in size. I thought I wasn't going to. I thought I was going to underproof it a little bit, but I let it fully proof. I let it puff up a little bit out of these rings and then baked it off, and you got a really great product. I popped it out of the ring and baked it just a little bit longer to make sure that the inside texture baked off a little bit further, but you can see it's actually a really, really great product. And I'm going to cut this one open too because I want you to see it. It's light. It's fluffy. It has a really decent flavor, actually, similar to bread, I want to say, like not far off. Light and fluffy, so it'd be great. It holds structure, so you can put a hamburger right on that bad boy and eat it. Just look at the inside, though. It still looks like cake. It still is going to resemble that same kind of crumb texture that you get from a cake, but with the flavor of bread, okay? So that's really what you're attempting to do. It's not going to resemble bread, but it has enough structure, it's light and fluffy enough, and it has a similar flavor to where we can at least help those customers, those gluten-free customers out and give them something. You don't want to say that they're not normal, but feeling like you can't eat gluten-free products, you can't eat a hamburger while your friend's eating a hamburger, it takes away that feeling of normalcy. So that's what we can do. We can aid and help those customers feel as if they don't have to worry about what they eat. So this is a pretty cool product. I would say this is a really good recipe actually to start off of. I would love to start working on some modifications with this. When you guys get back into class, we'll try a couple different things. You can see in the recipe it says egg whites, right? Well, we know what egg whites do to a recipe. We know how they interact with a dough. And I like a really light, soft, fluffy hamburger bun. So I might try taking the egg whites out of these and subbing them out for egg yolks and see what happens. But pretty decent products. I'm happy with what happened here. Hope you guys learned something, and see you in the next video.